without much further ado, Susannah.
Thank you. I'm going to move this over so that I can hold my papers. Hi, everyone. I had a chance last night to meet the other speakers, and I can tell you that you're in for a great day. These people are awesome, and I can't wait to hear what they have to say. Can you hear me okay? All right. Am I okay, placement-wise? So my introduction to the healthcare system happened 6 years ago. My son was diagnosed with juvenile idiopathic arthritis, and he was 3. And the autoimmune disease causes painful swelling in the joints. It can lead to disability and, in rare cases, blindness. And we were told that he would struggle with this for the rest of his life. We started him on medication. The medication, though, didn't seem to do much for his arthritis, and at the same time, it made him feel really sick. He would spend a couple days a week lying on the couch every week after taking his medication. And as a mom, I looked at this and thought, I cannot accept that this is going to be his life. So we ended up hearing from another mom about something she had tried with her own child that helped. And after talking it over with our doctor, it centered around taking certain foods out of his diet, gluten and dairy. After talking it over with our doctor, he was comfortable that we weren't taking any risks. So we gave it a shot. And I was in the habit at that point of going into my son's room to help him out of bed. So he's a little 3-year-old guy, and he needed help getting out of bed. 6 weeks after we started this experiment, I went in there and he said, "Mommy, my knees don't hurt anymore." And he sprang out of bed and he was on his way. So that was our sort of introduction into learning that, you know what, when you exhaust all the answers that medicine has for you, there might still be something out there for you. And I began to hear about other families who, as Naveen said, had hit a wall and had kept going. And those are the stories I tell in my book. And today, I'm going to tell the story of a remarkable woman who came back from a disease that's considered flat out irreversible. Dr. Terry Wahls earned a black belt in Taekwondo when she was 23. When she was 48, she had to start using a tilt-recline wheelchair. She'd been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a disease that can disrupt the brain's ability to communicate with muscles. As a result of the MS, Terry's muscles had atrophied from disuse. This athletic woman now no longer had enough core strength to keep from flopping forward. The first time Terry's kids saw her in a wheelchair, it was disorienting and upsetting. Terry's daughter, Zebby, remembers her mom's performance the day the wheelchair was delivered. Terry attached a big smile to her face. "Look," she told her daughter, who was 9. "I'll be able to zoom around so much faster now. It's just for work because the hospital is really big." Terry's son, Zach, was 12. Seeing the ramp in his mom's minivan jolted him. "My mom's life, as I understood it, as a parent and as an adult, was over," Zach told me later. Their mom had trouble sitting up at dinner. She would have to lean forward and brace herself against the table. It was hard to watch, and Zebby would pretend not to see it. "I felt like I was intruding on a very private moment, like when someone doesn't want you to see them cry," she said. But Terry had never been one to go along with anything imposed upon her. She'd always flown her own flag. She grew up on a farm in Iowa. At one point, her father asked her to sign over the title to a cow her grandfather had given her, to an entity called John Wahls and Sons. She said no. He needed ownership to be able to sell its calves. She said she'd be happy to do it if the name was John Wahls and Family. Her father started yelling and grabbed the directory. He showed her how every other farm was named after the men and the boys. "See, this is how everyone else does it." To Terry, this was not a persuasive argument. She held firm and kept her cow. She was 10. Later, after medical school, when Terry decided she wanted to have children on her own, she ran into another wall. It was the tail end of the 80s, and as a single parent, she could not find a clinic that would perform in vitro fertilization. "Sorry," one physician told her, but they didn't do illegitimate children. By that point, though, Terry was used to smacking up against red brick and equally accustomed to hurling a grappling hook up to the top. She eventually flew out to San Francisco, where a sperm bank was willing to work with her. Her mother argued with her, warning that it would be too hard to be a single parent. Terry wasn't dissuaded. Once she was finally pregnant, she wrote in her diary, "Facing this alone, I will solve the problems." The entries reveal her already up and running resolve. So when the disease started to overpower Terry and the available medicines could no longer help her, she refused to concede. It helped that she tended to be stubborn. Stubborn, bullheaded, cantankerous, her brother Rick told me. "She's smart and she knows she's smart," said her other brother. "It's always been the world according to Terry." I asked him, "Does that perhaps signal insecurity?" "No, she's full of herself." Every evening after saying goodnight to her wife and 2 children, Terry would rev up her laptop, completely used up by the effort it took just to get through a day of teaching medical students and seeing patients. She would log on to the database of biomedical literature maintained by the National Institutes of Health. She scanned all the MS research. Perhaps by reading everything on MS, she could find something her doctors had missed. She focused on animal model studies because they were the cutting edge. Terry knew that it could take decades for a discovery to make it through all the safety trials, let alone be incorporated into medical practice. She obviously did not have that kind of time. After months of midnight digging, her shovel hit some interesting nuggets. A couple of papers mentioned that malfunctioning mitochondria in our cells could play a role in MS. Terry then looked up what was known about mitochondria upkeep. In one study, mice with an accelerated aging syndrome that were given a mixture of 31 specific nutrients lived longer lives. We'll be serving that for lunch. The idea was that the flood of good stuff protected against mitochondrial dysfunction. When mitochondria produce energy, they also emit exhaust, little molecules known as free radicals. When too many of these collect in the cell, they cause damage. MS is relatively rare, but wearing out our mitochondria is thought to be a driving force in the decline that gets us all aging. Antioxidants, vitamins in fruits and vegetables, are thought to mop up this toxic grime before it can cause trouble. Here was food offering a possible way to recovery. Terry started eating 12 cups a day of berries and vegetables, packing in all the heavy weights: beets, mushrooms, broccoli, blueberries, cabbage, and of course kale, that nutritional ingenue. Over the next year, Terry's strength came home to her. In addition to her new diet, she had also acquired an electrical stimulation machine, which physical therapists commonly use to help build back up atrophied muscles. She turned it all the way up and spent all of her waking hours in intense fizzing pain. If I'm going to fail, she thought, I want to have left nothing on the table. Soon, Terry started ditching her reclining wheelchair for an upright electric scooter. Then she started parking even that at the door of the clinic and using a cane to walk between exam rooms. Her feet made friends with the ground again. One day, 4 months into her 12-cup-a-day diet, Terry was scheduled to meet with her boss for her annual review. His office was up a big hill, so she headed out for the appointment on her scooter. Halfway up the slope, the battery died on her. Fuming at herself for not having left earlier, she got off the scooter, started pushing it up the hill. At the top, she found a campus shuttle stop, but the bus wasn't coming for another half hour. She checked her watch. She was already 20 minutes late. She didn't have time to wait for the shuttle, so she abandoned her scooter and pressed on. When she finally got to her boss's office, his secretary scolded her. "Where have you been?" Terry was flustered and apologetic as she walked in to face the chief of medicine. When he saw her, he didn't say anything. He wasn't annoyed. He had no words. The last time he'd seen her, about a year before, she'd been lifeless in her wheelchair, barely able to hold her head up. She had little use of her arms. She looked so ill, he was concerned about her ability to survive. And then to see her walk in, he told me, I mean, it was holy cow. I'll never forget it. For her part, Terry was so concerned about being late that she hadn't noticed that she'd just accomplished a major physical task. At home, everyone in the family was certainly aware of her increased mobility, but they had little faith that it was more than a last hurrah on a downward trip, a quirk of a reliably confounding disease. She still had a degenerative illness, one you didn't come back from, as far as anyone knew. One Saturday morning, Terry's son, Zach, now a teenager, was in the kitchen when he heard his sister Zebby yelling in the garage. He opened the door. Terry was reaching for a bike helmet. Zebby was saying, "You're out of your goddamn mind." Zach was more measured. Mom, you've got to be careful. It's a little different now. Terry and her wife, Jackie, used to enjoy 20-mile rides together. But as her MS progressed, it had stolen her balance. By the time Zebby was making a fuss in the garage, it had been 6 years since Terry had been on a bike. Here's what happened. Terry is saying, I think I'm okay. I think today's the day. And by now, Jackie's come out. She starts lowering the seat on Terry's old Trek bike, which Zach had been using. They all walk down the driveway to the street. Zach helps his mother get her leg over the bar, since her balance was still a little iffy. Both he and Zebby take up positions on either side of her. As her feet press on the pedals, the kids start running to keep up with their mother. Zach is ready to push her toward the grass for a softer landing if he sees her start to wobble. And then she goes. They were all crying. That moment means more than almost anything I've ever experienced, Zach told me, seeing my mom on a bike. So what made Terry Wahls different from most people? What made her think her own actions could change what was likely unchangeable? I asked this question of Angela Duckworth, the University of Pennsylvania professor of psychology who coined the term grit, which she defines as perseverance and passion for very long-term goals. She says that grit stands out as a major predictor of success, more than IQ, more than social intelligence, more than family background. Among West Point cadets, National Spelling Bee contestants, salespeople, teachers, students, the ones who do well share this one quality. They're persistent, and being persistent often works. Terry, with her exceptional, almost crazy determination, bears this out. But how did she get that way? What makes a person gritty, be indomitable? We don't know yet. And until science figures out why people become resolute, Duckworth says one way to try to understand motivation is to look at the rational agent model of economics. The idea is that people will try to do things that seem likely to work out and are good for them and not bad for them. The thing is, we all calculate these values differently. People have individual interpretations of what constitutes a long shot or a jackpot. Say someone worked for 15 years on developing a transistor, a device used in electronics. From the outside, you might look at that effort at the start, calculate the probability of success and the potential payoff, and come to the conclusion that the person working on this is out of his mind. But from the perspective of the entrepreneur, the extended effort is completely rational. The stereotype is that entrepreneurs are risk-loving, but it's actually not the case, Duckworth says. They just see better odds of success, particularly if you're self-confident. The value of the payoff can be just as subjective. When you look at really gritty people like Nobel laureates, the payoffs for them are in the currency of interest and purpose, says Duckworth. In other words, the payoff is a sense of meaning, and the value of meaning of that form of compensation is much higher than people on the outside can appreciate. Though she hasn't directly studied persistence in the face of a health problem, she says, for a parent, I think, to have something that's meaningful or relevant or consequential for our children might trump everything. It's wired. It's in our makeup as humans. The payoff, she says, is infinite, which is certainly how I experienced it. And I can imagine that saving your own life, as Terry did, would be a similar jackpot. Another key factor of grit, of course, is hard work. And this, too, is another variable. People have very different subjective experiences of effort. The research shows that really gritty people don't experience hard practice as aversely as other people do. For them, the costs are actually lower. Really gritty people eventually learn to do highly effortful things without the subjective cost. But none of this works if there isn't also hope. There's no grit without it. And that's because if you expect that you can't do anything about your situation, then the rational response is not to do anything. So you have to maintain hope. So what is hope? Basically, the idea of hope is the expectancy that there's something I can do to improve my situation. And one of the things that would make you lose hope is to perceive that you can't. And your perception is informed by your life history. What in your life have you learned? What has taught you that if you keep working at something, it will work out? And that basic insight, if you really want to take hope one level deeper, is about expectations that you can do something. And that, in part, is influenced by your history of being exposed to situations where you can do something or not. And this seems like a possible explanation for why Terry was so resilient. She had a history of agency, of doing something, and of succeeding as a result. She'd already overcome a lot of difficulty by the time she had to confront illness. And certainly genes can't be discounted. And so what can we learn from Terry Wahls? I used to think that hope was rooted in the known possibility, however small. If you're diagnosed with an illness that 99 out of 100 people won't survive, you could still have hope because of that one example, that example of one. But then I learned about Terry and other people who faced diseases and conditions that it was unheard of to recover from, and they still thought recovery was doable. People whose children had food allergies, autism, intractable epilepsy, some of whom you'll hear from today. Under those circumstances, the reasonable thing would have been not to have hope. But these people recognized that there was no example of one, but rather than give up, they became it. Thanks, folks. Bert, if anyone has questions, you can ask me, or we can do it later. It's up to how people are feeling.
I have a question.
Oh yeah. Okay.
It seems that people who have children involved, whether you're a parent or in this case, women, stronger drive to be around for her children. I think that that's probably as a really extra drive and that persistence.
Right.
Experience
Yeah, I mean, the comment is basically it seems that children are a key factor in helping to drive persistence. And I would agree with that, although based only on anecdotal, just what I've seen, but also as a mother, it certainly rings true to me because, I mean, isn't that our biology? Yeah.
How's your son doing now?
The question is, how is my son doing now? He's great. He's 9. So right after he recovered, we took him off the medication, which he was never expected to be able to do, and he's been off it all these years. And he's great. He happens to be an identical twin, and when he was sick, his twin, his growth was stunted, and his twin got taller than he was, and now Shepherd, who is the one with the arthritis, is now taller than his brother, which is a kind of satisfying outcome, which I never fail to notice when I look at him. Fred?
How did you guys figure out what to do? And is he still on the diet that you came up with?
The question is, how do we figure out what to do? Unlike people I write about in my book, and unlike Terry Wahls, who's also in the book, I did not have a lot of hope, and I did not initially go looking for answers. We just got lucky. We heard this story from no kidding, my sister's husband's sister's friend. My sister called and said, do you want to talk to her? Because her son had juvenile arthritis, and she did this thing, and he's now better. And initially, I poo-pooed it. And then once I saw that Shepherd was not getting better on the medication and felt bad on it, I felt desperate for another option. And that was when I called up this other mom, and I'd never met her, and she told me what she did, and which was, as I said, involved taking certain foods out of his diet along with giving him anti-inflammatory supplements. And so we just did what she did. We thought, well, we can't not try. It's not harmful. We made sure it wasn't harmful to try it. And I didn't feel we had an option not to try it, to give it a shot. What was interesting is that when I was working on the book, and I started talking to researchers and doctors, they said, oh, yeah, that I could see why that would help your son. And I thought, where have you been? And why do you know this and this other specialist doesn't know this? And so that was one of the reasons I wanted to, or it is the reason I first wrote about it in the New York Times, was I just wanted to get the information out. Your other question was, is he still on the diet? No. There's another woman I write about in the book who reintroduces foods to children with food allergies. And when I approached her about writing her story, she said, why don't I work on Shepherd? That way you can really see what I do, and you can really understand the process. And I thought, well, I agreed to do it because I thought it would be wonderful for Shepherd not to be vulnerable to a flare-up. He'd had a series of, over the course of years, he had accidentally been exposed to gluten and had had immediate flare-ups. So I thought, well, if he could not be vulnerable to that, it would be great. And so he worked with this woman whose therapy is incredible. I mean, children who have anaphylaxis and have run to the hospital from an allergic reaction are now eating everything. And her therapy has been so successful anecdotally that Boston Children's is now studying it. Anyway, so she worked with Shepherd and reintroduced foods to him, and it was fine.
What was the actual diet consist of?
The question is, what did the diet consist of? We took, along with removing gluten and dairy, there were other things we took out. Nightshades, which I thought to maybe be inflammatory for some people, and that's tomatoes, potatoes, peppers, eggplant. We took those out. We limited as sugar, which can also be inflammatory. I'm trying to think of what else. I think that was it in terms of the diet. There was an anti-inflammatory Chinese herb, which we gave him, and high doses of omega-3s in fish oil. Shepherd now, as I mentioned, is now eating everything. But we still limited sugar just for health reasons.
For either your story or for any of the patients in your book, have you seen the medical community start to receive the knowledge and evolve at all?
That's a good question. Has the medical community responded or changed? And I think there's been a difference. So when we first saw other doctors for other second opinions, and this one woman said diet does not work, and I think, we have not gone back to her. I doubt her opinion has changed, but I have seen a sort of openness among just in talking to people while I was working on the book, and I think it's being driven by all the microbiome research, where, as you're well aware, we are learning that this population of bacteria is a key factor in our health. Well, what's the one thing or one of the main ways we can affect that bacteria is by what we eat, and either for the bad or for the good. And so I think that has given the idea that a diet could affect an autoimmune disease a lot of legitimacy. We're not there yet, we haven't proven it, but there are a lot of indications that there's a real connection.
I'm curious, how many of the stories that you write about in the book do involve dietary changes?
Well, so I write about the food allergies, which is a different kind of dietary change. It's reintroducing foods. There's a woman with rheumatoid arthritis who tries diet changes, gets better, but not all the way, and she eventually experiments with a fecal transplant. But again, it's sort of in the realm of this microbiome science. And there's a child with autism who also sees a dramatic recovery after changing her diet. And who am I leaving out? Oh, MS. So it's a common theme, certainly, throughout. But once I had written the book, I realized that actually, more than diet, the theme was never giving up, and that these people had exhausted everything and kept going. And that became the most interesting question to me: is how do you get that? How do you keep hope like that going when no one else has succeeded? So, Fred.
Do you think there's a difference in...
Sorry, just for the people online.
Is there a difference in the kind of grit that people have when it applies to their kids and and themselves and their health and everything else in their life? Or does it tend to translate?
I don't know. I can't tell you a real answer because it's not the kind of thing that's been studied. But certainly in the people that I wrote about, they had a history of being persistent. And so because I wanted to understand, as I mentioned, where that came from. And they were like that from the get-go. There's this one mom who moved across the country to get this allergy therapy, this unproven allergy therapy for her child. But her history was, her father had left the family when she was young, and she had written him letters weekly for years. I mean, I think it's a personality, but that's just me talking from observing 7 people, which is not science, but it makes some sense to me. How do you, as a parent, Fred, who has persisted, what is your take on that?
Totally unfair of you to ask that question. You're not supposed to turn it around. I don't know. It's part of the reason I asked the question. I mean, I know that as a parent, you feel this instinctive need to fire every round and then go grab sticks and rocks and make other kinds of ammunition to kind of go at whatever you're trying to go at. And I just didn't know I don't know whether or not that would, for everybody, whether or not that would translate.
Right.
I mean, I would say, yes, most people would say I'm a pretty tenacious person, and most people would say that my wife Evelyn is a pretty tenacious person. But it's hard for me to separate it.
Yeah. Well, you and I are both journalists, and I think that by being a journalist, we have certain skills that make us, in my case, probably unpleasant to live with, where I just, you can be so relentless. But that has worked well in journalism, and I think when you're facing something impossible, that's probably a useful trait.
My Evelyn, who is also a journalist, but an editor as opposed to a writer, will often say to me, "Stop reportering me."
Right.
She doesn't mean that as a compliment.
Right.
We have a couple of questions from online. Do parents push harder for solutions or the patients themselves? Who has more grit?
There's not an answer because that's not something that's been looked at in any kind of clinical trial. So I don't. I wrote about a range of people, parents and people who are fighting for themselves. But I can understand the persistence in both cases. And for me, it really wasn't something I thought about. It was just how things were, and in fact, I asked the people I wrote about, how do you maintain hope? How do you keep going? And one of the moms said, because she's not better yet. So it had nothing to do with the odds of success. It was just because she's sick. And the woman who developed this allergy therapy, I asked that question of, and I said, well, why would you have no medical background. What made you think that you were going to come up with the solution when everyone else is stumped? And she said, well, that's not how I think. I think, what do I want to do? And I thought, oh, that is awesome. I want to be that way. But so anyway.
One more is, we talk about preventative care. After your experience, what advice do you have for mothers in regards to the diet we are feeding our children?
Oh, well, you can't spend a couple years doing the research that I did and not come away feeling that maintaining a healthy gut bacteria population is really important for all of us, whether you have a disease or not. And there's enough science there to know that it is critical to our health. And so the main way that we can sustain this population is by feeding it. I mean, it's very simple. You basically just, like any living thing, you have to feed it. And the only way to feed it is to feed it fiber. Because if we eat refined carbohydrates, breads and sugars and pastas and those kinds of things, those are absorbed into our body before they can get down to where the bacteria live. So it's very simple. You eat a lot of fiber and vegetables, and fruit, although fruit also has sugar, so it's something to be aware of. But you eat a lot of fiber, you're feeding that population, and you eat a variety of it, you're sustaining a variety of that population. And we know that if you have a robust population with all different kinds of bacteria, that's associated with good health. So that was my one takeaway, which is fiber, fiber, fiber.
Okay, I think that's working. I love your overarching theme of persistence, and I think
Thanks.
this gentleman touched on maybe another overarching theme for this whole conference is how do you make people care? Like it's their kid. You know what I mean?
Right.
I think that is a fundamental question in healthcare these
Right.
days and in politics. How do you make people care? You can't. And I
Right.
feel like with the advent of social media, people are more and more distant from caring for each other. So
Right.
I don't know. I just think it's a interesting topic to consider.
Yeah, I mean, I felt that my job was to tell the stories and the best way that I could, and that and I mean that's what I do for a living, and so that's how I approach it, is to tell the story, and people will either care or they won't, but I can try. Yeah.
I just have a comment in answering some of what other people have said. I feel like having a problem is what drives change. So basically, how do we get people to care? Well, when it's your kid that gets sick or you come up against a wall, I've always found power in the word no. Whenever I've been told no,
Right.
it's always given me strength.
Right.
And then that builds upon that. And I think that's the pattern we're seeing in, finding answers and saying, no is not the answer, and I'm going to keep going until I solve this.
Yeah. I
And
think that's a
that's
great
what-
personality trait, when you actually are inspired by the word no. Anybody else? One more question over there.
You talk about a lot of the approaches taken by patients or families that are going through some sickness on how to solve it.
Yeah.
So from their perspective, what are things that they wish would have been part of the system, or what are some of the solutions you think they would like to see, I guess, to align with the theme of this gathering?
That's a great question. Because when you are pursuing something experimental, it's terrifying. And I felt this way, and the people I met felt this way, where they really wish they had guidance. And our doctor was lovely, and he was okay with what we were doing, but he couldn't offer guidance. He could let us know what was risky, but he had no background in nutrition. And there are people you're going to be hearing from later who are designing new medical schools and talking about who are designing new medical schools. And one of my takeaways is, I wish that doctors were taught nutrition in medical school, and because they don't know anything about it. And especially as we're seeing that food is such a fundamental. And so we've got a bunch of moms you'll be hearing from later who have figured out how to use food. But why can't we get professional guidance in that realm? I mean, it's wonderful that, so basically it's left to us to figure it out on our own. And it would be great if we could get some guidance on that.
Another online question, what is it about your own story that drove you to write a book?
I was not comfortable telling my own story because that's not what I do. And in fact, my husband wrote a memoir years ago, and I asked him in all seriousness, would it be possible to leave me out of it? Which I came to realize it was not, I couldn't really ask that question. But so the only reason I first wrote our story was because I thought, if there's a single family that could benefit from this, then I don't have a choice not to share it, because I also knew I knew that if you were a parent of a child with juvenile arthritis, you weren't going to learn about what we did from your doctor. And so I knew that I just had to get the information out. And my husband, who's also a writer, two of us went back and forth. You write about it. No, you write about it. No, you write about it. And finally, I just accepted that I had to do it.
If I turn it on, that always works better. How did you guys think scientific? How did you and the people that are in your book think scientifically about what they were doing? And when I ask that question, I don't mean, how did they? I don't mean it sort of in the traditional sense. What I mean is that if you're using food as a diet, if you're using food as medicine, or any of the other non-traditional treatments that are out there, if you're not careful, you can wind up mixing inputs, so that you don't know when something works, what specifically has actually worked.
Right.
How did you do that, and how did all the other people do that as well?
Well, you can't know on an individual basis. And I can't stand up here and say to you, my son recovered because we changed his diet. There's no way to know what made him better. There are clues, and there's a sort of personal belief I have that it was the diet, especially now that I know how diet can affect inflammation. But there's just no way to know. Maybe it was just, people recover spontaneously. And then there were clues, like I said, he had had gluten and he would have a flare-up, and so it indicated that was probably a factor. And when you're dealing with diet, you've got a lot of factors. That's why diet's hard to study. You're looking at all these different factors, and in science, we like to isolate the thing we're testing, the single molecule we're testing, and you can't really do that with diet. And so it wasn't science that we were doing. It was doing anything we could try to help our kids. What works, works. Or the fact that he's better is all I care about.
What I meant was, how did you? I wasn't so much thinking about isolating it as much as getting it to the point where you could keep where it was repeatable. Not just for you and the people who were doing it,
Right.
but
For other people. Yeah, when I was working on the book, an important part for me was to see, was there science already that could explain these outcomes? For example, there are more than several studies looking at diet and arthritis that have mostly been done in Scandinavia, but well-designed studies that show that you can have a big impact on arthritis if you take certain foods out of a person's diet. And so that's a sort of step to knowing what's repeatable. But we need to the fact is we need to do trials. We need to do trials to know for sure, and there's not a lot of money for that. You can't profit from a diet. And so, there isn't, if I were running a pharmaceutical company, I wouldn't invest in a clinical trial on diet either. You can't package kale. So, you can, but you can't really patent it and profit from it individually. But so that's the challenge going forward is, we look at the budget proposal and, money to NIH is slashed, and that's where we fund that's the funding mechanism for these things that we can't profit from. And so that's, as a society, I think we need to recognize that most of the research we're doing is pharmaceutical, and so, there's the profit motive that's determining whether something is going to be studied, which I'm all for that, but we can't be ignoring all these other options. We don't know enough about disease to say, oh yeah, the answer is not going to come from over here. And so that's one of the things I hope will come, I hope that will come, is that we will recognize we need to be studying all this stuff.
Hi.
No.
Okay, how about now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, comment followed by a question. Actually, what this raises for me is some questions about basic inequities in not just in healthcare, but in access,
Right.
Differences in income, health literacy, time.
Yep.
And I'm going to guess that many, if not most people who can seek alternatives really have those resources,
Right.
time, energy,
It's a really
education,
important point, yeah.
access. And so wonder if you just want to comment on that, or how we can really approach the system, of which I'm part actually,
Yeah.
to decrease the barriers for everyone so that it's not just a very small number of people who have certain privileges
Right.
to look for alternatives, but that this really becomes very widespread.
Right. Well, this is why I wanted to write about it, because that's how I know to get information out. And so there's that, you know, if there's an article or a book, then that's something anyone can access. But you're right that to figure this out and to become a lay expert, as Bert was saying, that's a job. And you also have to have certain skills. I mean, luckily I had some reporting skills that I could call on. But it's really hard and really overwhelming and really intimidating. And so it's not something everyone can do. And so I hope that by sharing the stories that can, you know, lend a hand to someone else who, I hope I did the work for some people. Yeah, I don't know the answer beyond that, because it is a challenge. I mean, the one thing, though, I will say in terms of having financial resources, you know, so take MS, for example. Some of the newest MS drugs are $92,000 a year, which is not sustainable, I don't think. But if there are certain MS patients who can control their symptoms by changing their diet, that's a nice cheap option. We don't know yet that that's a real option, but you know, to me, that's worth pursuing for cost savings alone, for everybody, for the system, for individuals. So that's one reason I hope will be an incentive to maybe study these things more, is that they're free. Oh, there you are.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your story. I found it's very inspiring.
Thank you.
And, you know, as a patient and caretaker myself, and then I really appreciate that your perspective that, you know, as a patient and families, we know our goals and what we want of our loved ones and ourselves.
Thank you.
And it just struck me that in your story, you mentioned that when you talk to your caregivers, you know, the physicians, and they say, "Oh yeah, maybe, you know, that seems might work."
Yeah.
And you comment and said, "Why? How come they didn't know?"
Right.
You know, that's definitely happened. You know, for medical professions, they don't know everything.
I know,
You know,
that's such an important point. Yeah.
And also lots of time when they train, they are very concentrated in their field.
Yes.
You know, physicians and psychiatric and or cardiologists and you know. So I just, you know, now the care is so complicated, involved a team working.
Yeah.
And that's this idea saying that you involved people from different interprofessional care team. So I just wondering whether you have thought about using your story to reach out to the medical professions and in the medical schools and try to promote the interprofessional training so that the medical profession will broaden their scope of how they practice in a way that, you know, we also involved with the University of Washington doing some teaching with a student, and they try to train student in a setting of interprofessional care.
Yeah.
And the one training session was very interesting. They got dietitians on the team. They got PA. They got the nurse. They got no physical student. But it was very interesting that they come out of care plans and then what to come out of treatment after follow up after patient discharged.
Right.
From the hospital. So I just wondering your thoughts on that and using your story to inspire the medical schools towards that way to teach a student from the beginning when they got out of school.
I can only hope. I mean, I can only hope that by sharing a story, I mean, I think that by telling stories, we can affect people. At least I've always felt that it's harder to tell people to do something than it is to share the story and let people see let people figure it out on their own. I think your point about doctors, and none of us knows everything, and I think that that's a really crucial point and important for all of us to know. And when I came to that realization, it took me a while to realize when we were going through this as a family that, oh, this doctor knows more about this disease than I ever will, but there might be things that he doesn't know. And that was a huge realization for me. And that opened up this world of, oh, there might be an answer. So I mean, and the other takeaway is that medicine's a human enterprise, which is not a criticism, but it's just a recognition of the reality. And knowing that you can, there are always going to be more places you can look. And persistence sometimes means seeing doctor after doctor after doctor, different kinds of people, like you're talking about. So yeah, I mean, I can only hope that the stories will get out and that people will take something from them. Anyone else? That it? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. That was great, Susannah. One of the things you said that just inspires me all the time is that if a single family can benefit from you telling your story, it was worth you writing the book. And that's, again, one of the things that we really wanted to try to impart to people today, is that it can be that simple, right? So really telling a story can just influence someone else to try to do something new. So we're actually at that rare point in a conference where we're a little bit ahead of schedule, and because we're doing a lot with our online audience as well, we're actually going to take a break for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to start with Dana Lewis at 9:45. So feel free to get coffee, restrooms are down